Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for taking time out of your week to spend a little with me. This week we are looking at the case of Randi Trimble, a bright, beautiful woman whose life was cut far too short by someone she trusted. Brian Trimble was well on his way becoming an amateur cameraman in a very B-level horror film with his good friend Blaine Norris when their funding ran short. When Randi refused to invest money into their passion project, resentment grew and Brian formulated a plan to not only get away from his wife, but also see Blaine's vision come to life. So, as always, I invite you to join me as we remember the life of Randi Trimble. Randi Trimble was born on December 15, 1974 in Norfolk, Virginia to her mother Nancy Chavez and father Gary Peck. She was an only child and the first grandchild in the family, and was loved by all. According to her mother's website, Randi was always smiling, and she had this impeccable capability of holding the attention of anyone. Growing up, Randi and Nancy struggled. Her father left early on, and this left Nancy to raise her daughter as a single mother. Money was scarce, but Nancy did everything to ensure her daughter never went without. Nancy worked a full-time job, a part-time job, and attended school at night. She was determined to provide the best life for her daughter. Randi had many hobbies. She did tap dance, baton, gymnastics, and Girl Scouts where she earned many badges. She also had a passion for music. In the 4th grade, she started playing the flute. Randi attended a private Catholic school called Trinity High School. Randi was very serious about her education and excelled in her studies. She starred in the school plays and joined the chorus and marching band. She graduated at the top of her class and furthered her studies by attending college at Bloomsburg University. Randi studied speech pathology and language. She also continued playing music. Despite being away from home, Randi and Nancy kept their very close bond. During her time in college, Randi met Brian Trimble, and the two formed a good, solid relationship. He continued to support his partner as she stuck to her goals. Randi graduated with her degree in 1999 and quickly landed an internship at the Hershey Medical Center. She spent her time expanding her knowledge and was eventually given her dream job, a full-time position at the Hershey Medical Center as a speech pathologist for children. The same year, Brian asked Randi to marry him after 5 years of courtship. Randi had a great work ethic, always working more than one job at a time. She was saving all extra money due to the upcoming nuptials. On September 9, 2000, Randi became Mrs. Trimble in central Pennsylvania. The couple led a wonderfully content life. They were well respected in the community, and their friends held them as the ideal relationship. The two were settled into a routine when Randi decided she wanted to start a family with the love of her life. She continued to work her second job in order to help save money and build a nest egg for the future. However, around the same time, Brian was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease in which the immune system eats away at the protective covering of the nerves. It results in nerve damage and disrupts communication between the brain and the body. Reportedly, his sudden diagnosis caused Randi to become very protective of her husband. But Brian read her caring nature as controlling, and the cracks began to show. Brian's condition also made it hard for him to do his day-to-day activities, so he had to rely a lot on Randi. Eventually, he did find work as an IT technician for Harrisburg Insurance Company. It was here at this job he made a new friend named Blaine Norris. Blaine was your average nerdy computer tech who had a passion for films. He was married to a woman named Wendy, and the pair shared a son named Mason. Although he had his 9-to-5, he was working on his own low-budget slasher flick. He wasn't a big name in the business, but his passion for the project allured not only unknown actors, but Brian, who wanted to be a cameraman. Blaine was described as not only a horror fan, but being completely obsessed with the genre. Many of the actors hired had no experience with actual acting, except for maybe 2 of them, but the few who did knew there would be problems with Blaine's project just by looking at the script, since it read like a Scooby-Doo episode, according to one of the actresses involved. The script was bare, but Blaine held high hopes that his movie would hold a candle to the successful Blair Witch Project, which was in the same vein as his movie. His movie, which he titled Through Hike, A Ghost Story, revolved around 5 hikers on the Appalachian Trail who are killed one by a ghost-type figure. Blaine even had an investor initially that provided $18,000 for funding. With casting done and funding secured, Brian started doing minor photography work by shooting headshots for the actors, but unfortunately he was not professionally trained and they turned out terrible. They were so bad it actually discouraged the investor. Based on the photographs alone, he didn't feel the project was going to be successful. Blaine refused to fire Brian as the cameraman, so the investor took his money and walked away from the project. With no funding, the future of the project was bleak. Brian decided to try and help out by investing in the movie with his wife Randi. He knew Randi was saving money, so he figured she would want to be a part of it since he was interested in the film. However, Randi wasn't okay with this, especially when she learned he was going to have to hike on the Appalachian Trail filming for a straight week. His diagnosis worried her and she begged her husband to step down from the project. Disgruntled, he agreed. Brian broke the news to Blaine and this really left his project up in the air. He had no funding and no cameraman or equipment since everything they had belonged to Brian. Blaine, however, wasn't going to let his dream die, so he opted to fund the project by maxing out his personal credit cards in the amount of $18,000, a substantial amount of money for someone who was making around $60,000 a year. Money wasn't the only issue, though. The demands of making a movie started to ruin Blaine's marriage. They fought constantly about finances since Blaine made drastic moves without consulting her. Blaine's very long list of problems seemed to only grow. At first, Blaine didn't show any signs of stress or pressure, and they went on with filming. During filming, the crew learned more about their nerdy director, including his love of the 80s slasher flicks and his fascination with the darker side of life, in which evil triumphs good. After their week in the woods, filming was wrapped. It was a long week with malfunctioning equipment and an incomplete film, but what they accomplished brought the group together, along with a newfound appreciation for Blaine amongst his cast. They all returned back to normal life. However, Blaine's normal life didn't exist. When he returned home, he found Wendy and his son were gone. He was in massive amounts of debt and couldn't afford to fund his movie anymore, so he put it on hold. Blaine's life was essentially falling apart, but he carried on. He returned back to work where he and Brian started hanging out again. Coworkers often said the two were odd friends since in many ways they were opposites. But they shared many similarities that others didn't know about, such as a failing marriage and their financials. Brian vented about resenting Randi more and more with each passing day, while Blaine was angry at Wendy for abandoning him while pursuing his dream. Blaine was in massive debt, while Brian couldn't really touch his money without permission. Many of Brian's coworkers recalled how Brian would ask to borrow money from his wife or have to get permission to withdraw funds when the office would go to lunch together. But regardless of this, Brian pushed it off and portrayed his union as a blissful one. But on January 10th, 2003, the unthinkable happened. The day started as usual. Randi went to work, and on this day, she also had a shift at her second job, while Brian made dinner plans with a friend. Brian returned home that evening after 8 p.m. to find his wife on the ground in the garage. Brian called 911 hysterical. He claimed he returned home and found Randi on the floor like a rag doll. He called out to her, but he got no response. He also assured dispatcher he didn't touch her and he left her exactly as he had found her. Within minutes, police were on the scene, and right off the bat, investigators sensed something was off about it. The Harrisburg police stated the scene was brutal. The victim was face down in a pool of blood with a cord wrapped around her neck. It was determined this wasn't her cause of death, however. Randi also suffered 27 stab wounds. To the trained eye, the crime scene was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. Cabinets were left wide open and drawers were overturned. In typical burglaries, the perpetrator goes straight for the goods, such as jewelry, and this scene didn't resemble that. The whole thing was too haphazard. During questioning, Brian was rather suspicious too. He didn't show the usual signs of grief. Investigators found it odd that he didn't bother to check on his wife. He didn't cradle her or check to see if she had a pulse. He also cried while talking to them, but they noticed he produced no tears. They were sure Brian was responsible, but Brian had an airtight alibi. He explained he was at the local TGI Fridays, which was close to 40 minutes from the Trimble home. He left home sometime before 7, where he met up with a friend and didn't return home until after 8 p.m. Police were able to confirm his story with his friend and a waitress at the restaurant. The coroner was able to pinpoint Randi's time of death around 7:30 p.m., and Brian would have been nowhere near the house at this time. Police were dumbfounded. The scene offered no other explanations. No foreign DNA or fingerprints were lifted. Investigators even tried bringing in different units in order to perform a thorough sweep, but nothing was found. But despite the lack of evidence and his alibi, they couldn't shake the feeling that Brian was somehow responsible. Days after the murder, Brian was already transferring thousands of dollars from the couple's savings account and had an eagerness to claim Randi's life insurance, which was in the amount of $100,000. This behavior threw up red flags. The investigation was still going strong even months after that fateful night. Detectives spread out trying to gather any new leads. They reached out to Brian's coworkers when they learned some new intel. Tracy Thompson was a coworker, and she claimed that once the news broke out about Randi's murder, she knew he was responsible. Allegedly in December before Christmas, Brian told her and some other coworkers that he wanted to divorce Randi. Then, when they returned from Christmas break, he had abruptly changed his mind, telling Tracy that he and Randi were working it out. Tracy told detectives it all seemed too suspicious, and she was very serious about Brian being involved. She also mentioned another interesting piece to her theory. She thought Brian would be too weak to carry out such a horrible act. She said he would have hired someone, and she felt like Blaine would have been the perfect candidate. He was odd, loved violence, and just so happened to be his best friend. At first, detectives just listened and felt it may be a little far-fetched, since he was just the nerdy guy according to coworkers. But after learning about his movie, they started to take the theory a little more seriously. Police had their focus on Brian, but started to see that he couldn't have acted alone. Brian was passive and seemingly incapable of doing something to such a degree. He wouldn't have had the courage. Even Nancy, his mother-in-law, was in complete shock when detectives revealed that he was a suspect. They tried to apply the pressure on Brian in hopes of a confession. A warrant was issued for the computer in the Trimble home, and the forensics revealed just what they had feared. A website was discovered that offered a tutorial for murdering someone. The manual matched step by step what was found at the crime scene, and interestingly enough, they also discovered this link was shared 8 days before Randi's death, with Blaine Norris. But investigators feared this wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction, and they wanted to make sure Brian wouldn't get away. In order to shake him up, police asked him for a recorded walkthrough of the crime. He had already been interviewed several times previously, but during this particular instance, he changed a very key detail. During his walkthrough, he told police he stepped into the garage and nudged Randi with his shoe. Not once did he indicate he touched Randi previously. In fact, he was very clear that he didn't. He wasn't questioned at the time because investigators did not want him to hire a lawyer. They worked diligently to keep him comfortable. They called him often to discuss the case and even showed up unannounced at his home and job. Even though they knew he played a role, all of these little crumbs weren't enough. They needed a confession from him. And eventually, their tactics paid off. Police invited Brian to the station for a chat, and he finally started to talk. They came right out and asked if he killed his wife. Brian replied no. Detectives asked, "But you know who did, didn't you?" Brian said yeah. Detectives asked, "Okay, who was it?" Brian replied it was Blaine. He explained he planned to pay Blaine $20,000 if he would murder his wife. When asked why he wanted Randi dead, Brian stated, quote, "We weren't getting along. She was controlling me. I couldn't put her through the pain of a divorce." End quote. With Brian's confession recorded, police now turned to Blaine. Brian was completely unaware he was in the crosshairs. In fact, he was focused on editing his movie, which was back on. They were faced with the same dilemma. Brian's confession wasn't going to be enough to secure the conviction, so they had to play the waiting game once more. Blaine had been questioned previously since he was close to Brian, but interactions with the police became more frequent, and this left him feeling very uneasy. His actors and friends stated he started being more skittish, and he had plenty of reason to be. Detectives eventually executed search warrants on his apartment and his car. Inside of his apartment, they found books on forensics where he highlighted passages on how to hide forensics. They also discovered a stash of guns and hunting knives, none of which were used in the crime. However, his car held the key, a receipt from Kmart. Investigators took the receipt to the store and asked for clarification on the purchases. Blaine had bought a box of plastic gloves, work gloves, a hooded sweatshirt, and pants. They asked the manager if the credit card used on this purchase made any additional purchases that day, and it turns out it did. A 6-inch fillet knife. This was the same type of knife that the forensic pathologist determined made the wounds on Randi. During questioning, Blaine explained his whereabouts that night and claimed his friends could corroborate his statement. His friends did state they were outside of Blaine's apartment with him between 7:15 p.m. and 7:30, and they spoke for a bit before leaving. After they saw Blaine, they stopped at a nearby gas station to fill up their car. With the verification of Blaine's alibi, police were back at square one. But before cutting Blaine loose, they decided to go to the gas station and check for surveillance cameras. The footage confirmed that Blaine's friends did stop in for gas, but according to the timestamp, they were an hour off. They had stopped at the gas station at 8:30 p.m., not 7:30 p.m., which meant Blaine had plenty of time to commit the crime and return home before they even arrived. Investigators felt like they finally had enough and arrested Blaine Norris at his apartment on the charges of first-degree murder. Blaine insisted his innocence and refused to give up anything. That was until he discovered they had Brian's testimony, and the DA was seeking the death penalty. Blaine was offered a plea deal of life in prison if he pled guilty to the murder of Randi Trimble. He was fearful of the death penalty, so he accepted. In 2004, both Brian Trimble and Blaine Norris were given life without parole. Norris never explained his reasoning for carrying out the murder, while his friends theorized it may have been due to Randi forcing Brian to quit his movie. Detectives were convinced that Blaine Norris was a serial killer in the making. He was and is matter-of-fact about the details of the crime, commenting that the killing wasn't like it was on TV. Brian Trimble has tried for years to overturn his conviction, but remains incarcerated at SCI Beamer Township in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Blaine Norris, too, has tried petitioning with no success, and is incarcerated at SCI Somerset in Somerset, Pennsylvania. In honor of her daughter, Nancy Chavez created Randi's House of Angels, a project of the Foundation for Enhancing Communities to help children and families exposed to domestic violence. Every year, the foundation offers a community event called Randi's Race, in which they raise money to benefit the free programs offered by Randi's House of Angels and support local programs and agencies for children. To learn more, please visit randishouseofangels.org. I'm also going to link it in the video's description. I think it goes without saying that this was a sad case. It's such a hard pill to swallow when the person you give your all to and trust wholeheartedly does something so awful. Randi had such a bright life, and reading about her through her mother's words really made me see the kind person she was. As always, I invite you to leave your thoughts below so we can chat about it. If you found this to be informative, please consider giving the video a thumbs up to let YouTube know you want more. And lastly, if you're not subscribed yet, you should, because we would love to have you under the ash tree. Thank you all again for making it this far. You are awesome, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Interacting with you all is one of the highlights of my week. Thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting me. I will see you all in the next one. Bye, friends.